Aloha, this is Brother Raphael from beautiful Hawaii. I trust you have read Genesis 21, and let's get to it. Before we discuss the issue with Hagar leaving and living in the way she left, we have to discuss a few laws that involve slaves and children. We get these laws from the Code of Hammurabi. If you ever have the chance, reading the Code of Hammurabi is a great exercise in understanding the ancient Mesopotamia way of thinking. That code is very fair, and it has a couple of items regarding slaves, servants, and children. Now, the first law that is involved in this situation with Hagar and Sarah, it says that if a wife cannot give children to her husband, then that wife, out of her own money, whether it's from the bride gift, from the dowry, from wherever, she has, from her own family, she has to purchase a slave, give it to the husband, for the husband to have children through the slave, and then those children will belong to the nuclear family. It will not be so much the slave children. It will be as if the slave is being a surrogate mother. Now, when you think about that, you say, well, what if this happens? What if this happens? What if this happens in the future? Because you can be certain there are going to be feelings, there are going to be desires, there are going to be all type of issues involved. And the Code of Hammurabi have two other items that cover this situation. The first one says that if the husband, the master of the house, the patriarch, if he accepts the children, if he recognizes the children, if he says, my sons or my daughters, then that child inherits as much as any other heir in the family. So in the case of Isaac and Ishmael, Ishmael will have inherited half of the inheritance of the estate of the father, of Father Abraham. And that is what Sarah don't want. But we cover that later. But second, the code says that if a father, if the master of the house does not recognize the children, then the slave is set immediately free with whatever she came in and with her children. Now, this is a very generous item here, because most Egyptian slaves would have cost about $35,000 in today's money. And the only way they could be set free is either through the generosity of the master, or if the slave purchased them their own freedom, which would have been impossible for a slave in that day and age. So the only way a slave could live with her children would have been if the father don't recognize the child. Now, in this case, in this whole situation, then what can we learn? What can we teach our children? This situation is very important, because this situation shows God's way of operating spiritually, or one of God's way of operating spiritually. Let me tell you what that means. Whenever you see something small, something tiny, creating a big explosion, you know God's fingerprints might be there. But if you see something small creating a big explosion, creating infighting, and then creating separation, then you know it is spiritual and God was involved. We saw it with Paul, we saw it with the Hebrew children, the Hebrew slaves, I'm sorry. And let me tell you how it happened in this case. In this case, we see that there's a party happening in order to celebrate the second or third birthday of Isaac. In that party, Ishmael, which is 17 years old around that time, he laughs at Isaac. He laughs or he mocks Isaac. Something that teenagers do all the time. Now, something that small, the laughing or the mocking of a toddler by a teenager, created an explosion. Now, Sarah went to Abraham and said, I want them out. I don't want him to share with the inheritance. Now, remember the second law we talked about, that if the father recognizes, then the child receives half, or receives, in this case, receives half of the inheritance. And she said, I don't want him to share the inheritance. What she's really saying is, I don't want him here because of the mocking. That small item created an explosion. So the first item is small. The second item is that it creates an explosion. The third item is that it creates infighting. And there was infighting between Abraham and Sarah because Abraham did not want to send his son away. That is Abraham's son, and he loves him deeply. So what happens? God shares with Abraham to go ahead and release him. And Abraham obeys, and there is the godly separation. It's a separation so both people, Isaac and Abraham, and Isaac and Ishmael, can fulfill their mission in this world. Now, when Abraham, I'm thinking about this because I'm trying to find a right way to say it. When Abraham sends Ishmael and Hagar out, he sends them with only a skin of water and bread. And for a person as rich as Abraham, who loved his son so deeply, that is unthinkable. So what is happening there? What is happening there are a couple of items. First, a slave will leave with whatever they came when they are set free. And in those times, in those eras, it was given a slave when they were sold to go in, they would have been given bread and water in order for when they were released, or if they were released, they would live at least with that. Now, I don't think that's the reason she left with that. I don't think that's the reason, that because it's a legal requirement that she leaves with what she came. The other item will be that anything she takes will have been part of Isaac's inheritance. You know, we saw it in the Code of Hammurabi that everything belongs now to one son. So that is not the issue either, because we saw it during the story of the prodigal son. When the younger son came back, he still had a party thrown with the animals or the food that would have belonged to the older brother. So we know that parents would have not done that, would not have sent Ishmael out with nothing, basically, with what was given typically to a slave, because he did not want to touch Isaac's inheritance. That's not the case. So it's not that he followed the law. It's not the case that he did not want to share the inheritance of Isaac. The real reason, after reading so much about how Egyptians were very proud people. Remember, later on, the Egyptians wouldn't even eat with Joseph, who was the second in command over all of Egypt. Egyptians were very proud people. Egyptians were city people, let's call it, because of the river there. The Egyptians had settlements, cities, kingdoms, and so forth, while Abraham was a nomad. So Abraham and Hagar were completely different people. So Hagar now is at a position to leave. Hagar now finally gets what she wants, which is her certificate of freedom and her son. And Hagar is most likely offered by Abraham camels, donkeys, food, whatever. But that's a proud woman. And the proud woman said, in my opinion, I cannot prove it, but I can tell by human nature, by how I am, by how the Egyptians were, and so forth, and by what Abraham said to the king of Sodom. Abraham, Hagar said, I'm not leaving with anything from your camp because I don't want Sarah to say I made Hagar rich. I guarantee you that's the reason Hagar left with that, because that's a proud woman. She's not taking anything from Sarah. She already took 17 years of heck from Sarah. She's not taking anything else. She's taking the things she wanted the most, her certificate of freedom and her son. That's it. That's all she wanted. And now with those two items, she's gonna go with the promise that God made for her son to make him a father of many nations. I can see Hagar saying no. Hagar living with her head held up. 17 years ago, God told her to submit to Sarah. And now, finally, God is setting her free through a little item that became a great explosion that created infighting and a separation. My friends, teach your children to find that pattern in life. When there's something very small that creates an explosion within their friends, infighting within their friends, and a separation within their friends, God was there. God is trying to protect your children. In this case, God is setting both apart in order for them to fulfill the plans that God has for them. In Christ's love, this is Brother Raphael. May the Lord richly bless you. Thank you.